Okay, it's now 11 a.m. so I think we can go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this webinar. For those of you who don't know me, I am Dianka Aesel, and I am the commercial lead for FruitLook. I work for Blue North Sustainability, and it's my honor and privilege to say welcome to Dirk Sutherland, our guest this morning. He is a consultant from Rooted, and he's going to be telling us a bit about how he has been using FruitLook to support his clients in terms of identifying variation in their fields and also soil moisture and all of that. So welcome to you as well, Dirk. It's really nice to have you here today. And before I hand over to Dirk, I just have some admin related things I just want to chat through. So for those of you who are maybe new to Zoom still, despite all of the virtual calls with COVID and all of that, if you do have questions, I think you're automatically on mute, but I will unmute you from my side as soon as I hand over to Dirk. So please feel free to ask, interrupt, or just let us know if you have any questions at any time. And you can also type a message in the chat or Q&A if you want to. That's 100% fine. And please, at the end, we really do appreciate all of your feedback. We'll be at the end of the webinar, there will be a little survey that comes through. So if you have 2 minutes to just fill that in for us, we'd really, really appreciate that. Okay, so then, yeah, without further ado, I'm going to hand over to you now, Dirk. Thank you.
Thanks, Dianka. Appreciate it. Hope you guys can hear me. Yeah, thanks very much for the opportunity, Dianka, you and your team. I think we discussed it in our previous stakeholder meeting. I think one of the big things that we have to realize when it comes to remote sensing is that the data is just as important as as relying that data to what is actually driving that differences that you see with regards to the remote sensing. So I'm going to try and make I want it to be interactive firstly, and also I wanted to basically I want you guys to really speak up if something doesn't make sense, but I want it to be practical, because that's the big thing with regards to these type of data, especially when it comes to remote sensing, is that it can. Because the data is so integrated that you have to break it down again and go and see what's the reason and what's driving those differences that you see within a specific field. So just to start off with, is to give you a little bit of background about who we are and what we do. So yeah, Rooted, we established the company probably about 3 years ago. And yeah, so we were a private consultation business with clients mostly in the Western Cape. We have a few clients in the rest of South Africa, and recently we got a few international clients on board as well in Africa. So we focus mainly on the fruit industry, but it's funny, since especially in the last few months with the fertilizer prices skyrocketing, we've really had people contacting us throughout the whole agricultural industry. So you can really sense that there's a longing within the agricultural industry to move towards effectiveness, and I think that's a positive thing. So we're a team of 3 agronomists. Combined, we have more than 50 years of experience within the field, and yeah, we believe in having a focused and scientific approach to fertigation and irrigation scheduling. And one of the big things we try and do when we go onto the farm and run our services on the farm is to create on-farm IP. I think that's something that has really been lacking in general in the industry. Is we've got very good norms set up per crop, but it's very general. So you have to try and get those norms, and you have to apply it to your specific farm and build norms for your specific farm. And we really try and do that with our data analysis. So we focus basically on 3 aspects of crop production, namely irrigation, soil fertility, and plant nutrition. And we believe if you can manage those 3 aspects to the best of your ability, you will create a plant that has very high energy. A plant that has very high energy will deliver, in most instances, a high crop, but with high quality as well. I think that's one of the things that we've been missing in the past. I did my background is actually more in viticulture, and during my studying days, there was a definite perception in the viticultural industry that as soon as you go above a specific threshold in terms of yield, you lose quality, and it's actually it's still very dominant within the field, in the viticultural field, but other crops as well. But the fact is that if you really manage this system effectively, what we've actually seen is that the higher producing crops actually has the better quality as well. So it comes down to a balance. So what we try and do is we evaluate each of those aspects constantly, and whenever we see a change or whenever we see a shortage, we try and address that in time or as quickly as we can. Okay, so I'm not going to stand still on this too much. I just want to give you a little bit of background in terms of how we run that process before we get to how we use remote sensing in this whole process. So firstly, when we come to soil fertility, excuse the Afrikaans in the table there, this is an internal document, so I didn't have time to translate it. But it comes down to, I just want to see if I can get a pointer going here. There we go. So it comes down to, for each and every one of these aspects, there's different factors, and each factor has what we call a critical point of interest. So that's the specific thing that we want to try and manage. And that point of interest has a specific data set that drives the decisions regarding that point of interest. So let's say chemical analysis. When it comes to soil fertility, in terms of the chemical side of soil fertility, our critical point of interest there is we want to create chemical balance within the soil as quickly as possible. So the way that we do that is we make use of just general soil analysis. And as soon as we did something, we will follow that up with a new analysis just to see where we are going. And all of that, we have then the physical factor as well and the biological factor. So each one of these has a specific data set that we use just to monitor our success. The same goes for plant nutrition. So here we have 4 factors. The first being just the withdrawal figure of the specific crop. So for each nutrient, every crop has a specific withdrawal norm in terms of NPK, calcium, magnesium, so all of the macro elements. Then we look at uptake curves. So uptake curve is also per crop as a specific uptake curve. So that's just, let's say, for example, I want to apply 120 kilograms of potassium to a specific crop throughout the season. Uptake curve basically just separates that 120 kilograms into different applications throughout the season, because I'm not going to apply the 120 kilograms of potassium at once, because that's not driving effective efficacy. So it basically just comes down to what percentage of the total amount I have to apply when. So this is a big driver of effectiveness when it comes to plant nutrition. And then the last one is concentration management. So, and this is has more to do with constant fertigation. So the important thing to realize when it comes to nutrient use efficiency in plants is that plants don't see kilogram per hectare. That it doesn't, you know, they don't work that way. Kilogram per hectare is a way for us to quantify the amount that we want to give and the amount that the plant needs, but the plant feeds in parts per million. So concentration is the main driving force behind nutrient use efficiency. And we really try and manage that very effectively within the irrigation water. Dianca, sorry, if I can just ask you if there's any questions, you will monitor it, right? And you will relay them to me.
I will do that, Dirk. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Okay, and then lastly, irrigation scheduling. So this is something that we've been really focusing on for the past 2 years. My two colleagues and I, our background is mostly or we come from the chemical fertilizer industry, and we worked in fertigation. All three of us have been working in fertigation for quite a while. And in the past, especially when we were, all of three of us were still working for companies that sell fertilizer, there was a very big value placed on the fertilizer side of fertigation. But what we realized when we started to see clients on a private basis is that irrigation scheduling is where everything starts. I mean, it's in the word fertigation, you know. So so we're moving towards a place where this is actually the basis of all of our programs. So our fertilizer programs is based on an irrigation schedule. We aren't there yet, but we are moving in that direction very quickly. So the irrigation schedule will actually always trump the fertilizer schedule. So to give you an idea, and this is very relevant to the Western Cape, early in the season, in most instances, we have wet and cold soils. And what we've been seeing is that so there's a very low demand in terms of water, actually, you know. So but what has been happening is the people really, the farmers want to get that fertilizer in. So now they over irrigate to get the fertilizer in, and that's actually much more detrimental than actually just saying, you know what, I don't have the time, I don't need the water, so I'm going to leave that fertilizer, I'm not going to apply it. So that's where we're heading towards. We're heading towards a place where your irrigation scheduling will always have a higher weight than your fertilizer schedule. So if you don't need to irrigate, you're not going to apply fertilizer. All right, so moving towards the way in which we use remote sensing to basically drive decision making. Just a few talking points that I'm going to focus on. Firstly, I want to establish the two types of data that we have to that we make use of. Secondly, the way in which we establish sample points within those two data types. And then I'm going to focus on problem identification, and I want to really make that part of the presentation as practical as I can. But I want to show you how chemical, physical, and irrigation differences can actually drive those anomalies within a block that we see. Okay, so firstly, the two types of data. Within this whole process that we try and follow, we differentiate between two definite data types. So the first is the monitoring data. So in terms of the way that we approach it is, if we go onto a farm, one of the first orders of business is to establish a monitoring protocol. And that is established per farm, and it is laid out beforehand. So we will have certain analysis that we take once a year, other analysis we will take once every second or third year, and some analysis we might take even as much as 2 or 3 times a year. Something like a water analysis, especially if it's on a farm that uses that doesn't have very high quality water. We will monitor the quality of that water up to 3 times a year to make sure that we know that what we're working with. So that's monitoring data. That is a data set that forms part of your monitoring protocol. Then the second data type that you have is problem identification data. So that is specific to a specific area within the block. So if I can separate those two from one another, the monitoring data, it gives you info about the block as a whole. The decisions that you make and that you implement with regards to that data is implemented on the block as a whole as well. So, and the monitoring data is taken at a specific time each year or every other year. So that time is established beforehand. And then that data is taken at a specific point each year or every other year as well. So those points are fixed. And I'm going to elaborate on that just now. Then problem identification data, that's a different data set. So that gives you information about a specific area within a block. All right, so decisions are taken on, or the decisions that are taken and implemented are just for that specific area. It's not for the block as a whole. And then it's not it's taken as the problems arise. So you know you don't know when a problem might arise, so you can't really implement that beforehand. And then lastly, it's taken at that specific point where the problem was identified. One important thing to realize, and I'm going to elaborate on that further, is that a specific block at specific stages can have monitoring data coming in and problem identification data coming in. All right, so the problem identification data will never substitute the monitoring data. This will always run, and we run this one whenever it needs, or whenever we need that type of data. Okay, so establishing sample points for monitoring data. All right, so that's the data that forms part of our monitoring protocol. So just a few points with regards to how this process worked before we had remote sensing. And I think this is the way that most people still do it. So in the past, your final sample would have been combined by crisscrossing the block and taking various sub-samples, right? So these sub-samples were nearly combined in a final sample that is taken away for analysis. So the idea behind that process is that by taking many sub-samples and increasing the sample size, it cancels out variation. So that was the idea, or that is the idea behind taking a lot of subsamples and combining it into one final sample. Okay, so but there's a few things that we have to realize when we do this. Firstly, is how many subsamples is enough, and so there's a bit of variation coming in there, right? So if you, let's say you have a block that's very that has very different swirls, then you actually have to take more subsamples compared to a block that is very homogeneous. Secondly, the final sample should actually be a weighted average of all the subsamples, and that never happens. So let's say your final sample weighs 1 kilogram and you took 5 subsamples. Then to be very accurate, you're actually going to have to go and weigh each subsample into 200 gram samples and combine that to the final 1 kilo to get your final 1 kilogram sample that you're going to send away. Now I can promise you nobody does that. Okay, then the next point of what if the next year your subsamples varies from the first year, and that's definitely going to happen. So if you crisscross that block this year and you crisscross that block next year again, you're not going to take that subsamples in the same spots. So basically what happens is, in an effort to increase sample size, variation is actually increased as well without the benefit of more accurate data. So just to show you an example, let's say that's your specific block. So you can see that the area in the middle here is much better compared to the rest of the block. And let's say a lot of people do this. You have sample rows. So let's say those two lines there show the sample rows. So the person that takes the sample will go down this row and go down this row and take subsamples in the rows. At the end of the day, what's happening here is you take many points, but that rows doesn't necessarily translate to better data, because this variation runs across the rows like this. So, you know, all of the samples that's taken in this area here actually won't represent the block as a whole. So you're getting a skew data set. So in this instance, a large part of the final sample would be made up of the better part of the block. So that area is not necessarily representative of the block as a whole. That's easy to see. And last thing to say about this, I believe is very important, is the biggest opportunity to increase the yield of this block as a whole actually lies in the weak areas. So if you're going to make decisions based on the better area of the block, you're actually getting to a place where you know you aren't putting yourself in a position where you're going to increase the yield in these areas, because you are seeing this data mostly. So that's a problem. So what we do is, rather than that, we move to a system that looks like this. So now what I can do is I can use this data to plot the specific areas within the block that is most representative. And because it's visually represented with colors, you can basically plot that specific pixel, and you can go and create a waypoint for that specific point within the block, and then that area is fixed. So what we do is we use the cumulative biomass as a parameter to choose 2 or 3 points that represent the block the best. So it's important to use the cumulative biomass because it shows you the progression of the block over time and the variation in the block over time. Where if you use the weekly data, then sometimes there might be certain differences within the weaker and better spots. So it's better to use the cumulative biomass because it shows the development of the block over time. Okay, so by doing this, you decrease sample size. So the guys that do stats are going to freak out here, but I think the important thing to realize is that by decreasing the sample size, you're increasing the accuracy in this instance, because the points that you're choosing is the most representative points. So that's the first thing. The most important thing for me regarding this is that even if you don't represent the block 100%, so there, I mean, we can say that to one another as a starting point, that you know there will always be a fault factor within any sample. But if that point that you're placing or where you're drawing the sample from, if you can repeat that the next year, then at least over time you're going to that fault is staying the same. That fault factor is staying the same. So it's important for that data to be repeatable. So that 2 points that I showed, that I'm showing in this point, that is fixed for this block, will probably be fixed for the rest of this block's lifetime. So that's an important thing with regards to this specific data. So you're not only increasing accuracy, but you're increasing the repeatability of the data set. So I can know that if I go and draw a sample next year on that same points, the variation that I see between this year's data set compared to last year's data set, it is in most instances driven by what I did, not because of another data set completely. All right. So sorry, let me just say, yeah, okay. So then establishing sample points for problem identification. So that was for monitoring, in terms of general monitoring, in terms of the monitoring protocol for that block. So this is for problem identification. Like I said earlier, when a problem arises within a block, it could be that that block has its normal monitoring protocol running, but then this is added data to that specific data that you already have. So this is purely for problem identification. So this data will never substitute the monitoring data. Okay, so once again, the sample is taken at the specific point. So in this instance, if you look at this block, you can see that this area, for some reason, is falling flat. So this would be the area that we are trying to take the data from. All right, so we're not going to look at the block as a whole. We're taking it specifically from this area. Once again, it has to be repeatable. So even in this instance, we also mark that with a specific waypoint, so that if we do implement some change in this area, then we can do a follow-up analysis to see what happened. And like I just said, the normal monitoring protocol still applies to the block as a whole. And it's an extra data set. So going into problem identification, so I'm going to focus on those three things that I mentioned earlier: chemical variation, physical variation, and then I'm going to show you a few interesting things with regards to how this data can actually show you when there's a problem with your irrigation as well, your irrigation design. So focusing on chemical variation firstly, back in the days when I was still working for a fertilizer company by the name of Omnia, we did a very intense research over 2 to 3 years. We correlated NDVI data with chemical, biological, and physical variation in the soil. And one of the interesting things that came from that is that the chemical analysis of the soil is very, very low correlated between the weaker spots of the block. And that's quite interesting, because I think in most instances, when we see a weaker area in the block, the first thing that we want to do is we want to draw a soil sample and send it away for chemical analysis and try and use that as a basis to see what's going on. But the fact is that chemical variation has the lowest correlation between weaker and better areas. So I believe that we place too much value on chemical analysis, especially as it relates to variation within a block. But there is one exception, and I'm going to show you that now. So this was taken at this specific block, and so you can see the top analysis here was the normal soil data that came from the monitoring protocol. Okay, so this is representative of the block as a whole, and this one at the bottom here, this was taken in this area here. All right, so one of the big things that immediately jumps out here is the pH variation between the two. So you can see this one is a pH of 5.8 and this one is a pH of 7.1. Just also as a side note, that this pH was taken with potassium chloride, and it is well established that potassium chloride gives a pH reading 1 unit lower than what water would have. So this is actually, in water, this is actually a pH of 8.1, which is quite high, and this is 6.8, which is pretty much in the area where you would want to be. So taking those two analyses, firstly, the driver here of the variation is the high pH. So high pH decreases nutrient use efficiency, especially when as it pertains to phosphorus. So I don't know if most of you have probably seen this. So this is just the different nutrients and its availability at different pHs. This is water pH. So you can see as the pH goes up, the effectiveness of phosphorus comes down, and definitely with regards to the microelements as well. So nitrogen and phosphorus use efficiency comes down rapidly as pH increases, and all of your microelements as well. Another thing is the high calcium content. So the reason why this pH is so high is because this soil has a very high calcium concentrate, so concentrate. So it's a calcium basically is a basis forming nutrient. So the higher the calcium content, the higher the pH would be. And calcium as an effect on also on phosphorus uptake, because excess calcium can actually bound phosphorus that it's not available for plants to take up. And another thing is that high calcium content decreases potassium availability. So this is the Mulder's chart, and it just shows the way that different nutrients interact with one another as it pertains to root take up by plants. So, and as you can see, calcium has an antagonistic effect on potassium for uptake. So the interesting thing to mention when you look at these two analyses is if you didn't know that this one was taken at the better, or if you didn't know that this one was taken in the weaker area, you would have probably said to me that this is the better analysis, because look at the high phosphorus content and look at the high potassium content. So most of the nutrients in this one is actually higher compared to the better part of the block. But one thing to remember is that if a plant doesn't perform optimally, it doesn't take up nutrients optimally as well. So there's a reason why that phosphorus is so high there, and there's a reason why that potassium is so high there. And it basically comes down to the fact that the plants just can't take it up. You know, they aren't performing in the way that they should. And the problem with this is actually money in the bank there. So you applied that phosphorus and you applied that potassium to the soil, but it's only lying there now. It's not available for the plant to take up. So yeah, this is one of the biggest drivers of chemical variation within the soil. And in my opinion, one of the most important ones is pH. Because like I said, a lot of the other nutrients, there's actually a very low correlation between the levels in the soil and the variation that you see in the block itself. Okay, moving to physical variation. So I have two samples that I can show you here. This was a report that we drew up for one of our clients. So this is citrus, and the whole idea behind this was to actually try and help him to bring up the weaker areas in his fields. So once again, we went through that whole process where we took the cumulative biomass. We established the sample points in the better and the weaker areas within these blocks, and then we looked at chemical and physical analysis of the soil and to see what is driving that variation. So I'm just going to focus on the physical side of things now. And once again, sorry for the Afrikaans, but this is also a document that went out to the client himself. So this is just the block number. This is the area. So the top here is the better area. This is the weaker area. Here we just classed the texture, the soil texture. So as you can see, the better area compared to the weaker area, they actually have the same soil type. There wasn't a change in soil type. In this instance, the driving force behind the variation was actually the amount of, or the percentage of rocks within the soil. So the better area had 20% volume. It was made up of rocks, and 40% of the soil volume was made up of rocks in the weaker area. So basically what it comes down to is the better area or the weaker area just has, physically it has less soil for that specific crop to grow in. Another factor that played a part here is that the weaker areas was actually at the top of, it's on a slope, the block is on a slope, and the weaker areas were at the top of the slope, where the better areas were at the bottom of the slope. For this specific block here, it's exactly the same as the one on top here. So the better area, once again, the texture is exactly the same between the two areas. It just comes down to the amount of rock within the profile. So once again, the better area just has more soil to work with compared to the weaker area. Okay, moving to just another example. So this was this photo here. So we did a profile inspection on this area here to see how it correlates with the better part of the block. So this photo was taken in that area there, and unfortunately it's not easy to see on the photo, but this is a very this soil has a very high clay content. You can see those lines there was actually caused by the hammer. So we hacked open the profile with a hammer, and that was actually caused by the hammer there. So if you see that type of marks, then you can know that it has quite a high clay content. Other thing that isn't as visible in the photo is that this soil, as it is here, is waterlogged completely. So there's very little oxygen in the soil. It's anaerobic, and as you can see, there's very little root development. And that is basically just because the oxygen levels in the soil has been depleted completely. There's no oxygen. If there's no oxygen, you won't have roots there. Anaerobic conditions also creates a situation where you might have a problem with pathogens. So, you know, it just drives a system that isn't conducive to soil health and healthy root system. So this one in the exact same block, taken at this better spot here, you can see that it's a much more sandy soil. It's not waterlogged at all. It's aerated. There's a lot of oxygen. You can see the root development there compared to the other one. So in this instance, that physical variation within the soil drives the variation that we see in plant growth. So, and I think this is, and to come back to what I said earlier, is if we just had to take a chemical analysis of the soil without seeing the soil profile like this, it would not have made sense. So we really need to place a very high demand on opening up the profile and to see what's going on there, because the answers jump out at you in a way that a chemical analysis won't ever give you answers. So I think this is quite important to get that idea in your head, that, you know, at the end of the day, the growth that you see at the top is the foundation is laid at the bottom. So we need to open up that profile and see what's going on there. Okay, and then we come to the irrigation. So just before I go to the specific sample the example that I want to show you, I just want to, and I know this is probably something that most of you already know, but especially when it comes to drip irrigation, we have to realize that the soil type basically determines the way in which that soil will move the water within the profile itself. So in most instances, a clay soil will move the water further horizontally, but not as deep, all right? And then a sandy soil will move the water deeper, but not as much in a horizontal direction. So when it comes to irrigation design, especially when it comes to drip design, the soil type is actually the thing that should drive the decision making with regards to what type of irrigation are you going to place on the soil. So in this instance, let's say it's a clay soil, and the same goes for micros as well. So let's say it's a clay soil, then you can actually go to a system where you have where your drippers are further apart, because it moves more horizontally. But you should probably have a lower delivery then. And with sandy soils, your drippers should be placed more narrower, closer to one another, but you could maybe get away with a higher delivery. So that's just a little bit of background. So unfortunately, I don't have an NDVI image of this one, but I'm going. I think it's going to the difference is going to jump out at you in any case. So when it comes to this specific profile, I want you to see a few things. Firstly, that there's very low or very little root development in the top 20 centimeters of this soil. So you can see there not a lot of root development there. Then the fine roots, the finer root hairs, in this instance, it developed deeper and more to the side of the drip zone. Unfortunately, you can actually see the dripper there. You see that's where the dripper is placed. And this was, I think, 0.6 meters apart, these drippers. So you can see that the roots developed at the bottom of the wetting zone and to the side of the wetting zone, especially those fine roots. And remember, the fine roots are actually the ones that drives nutrient use efficiency in our soils, because nitrogen and water can run in with thicker root systems, but to pick up potassium and phosphorus and calcium effectively, you need those smaller, finer root hairs. So that's the important ones. That's the ones that we want to develop as much as possible. So basically what's happening here is oxygen is being depleted right under the dripper. And because that happens, so contrary to what people might say, roots don't move to where they have the most available water. They move to where they have the most available oxygen. So that's very important to understand. As soon as you deplete oxygen, because obviously there will be a lot of water underneath the dripper here, but there's no oxygen there. That's why the roots are moving deeper and to the side. So one other thing that's important to understand, especially as it pertains to nutrient use efficiency, when you deliver your nutrients through your water, in this instance it is the case, then you're delivering that nutrients in this wetting zone. All right. So a lot of the nutrients that we add aren't very mobile in the soil, especially things like phosphorus and calcium. So if you're delivering the nutrients within this wetting zone, but your roots are developing to the side, then it actually creates a system where your nutrient use efficiency is very, very low. One interesting thing that we've done in the past, and I don't have analysis of this specific example, but I can assure you that it does happen, is if you go and draw a sample, so sometimes we draw subsamples within a profile as well. So we will combine the soil analysis from this area here and this area here and compare it to this one here. And I almost want to say in 90% of cases, this area here is actually toxic with phosphorus. We've seen certain instances where the phosphorus content goes up to 200, 300 parts per million. And bear in mind that the norm is usually around about 25 to 40 parts per million. So you get a situation where phosphorus actually becomes toxic, and that's just because you are adding it to this area here, but you don't have any roots there, so it's actually accumulating in that area.
I see
Yes.
we have a question. Annalene, go ahead.
Hi, thanks. Hi there. Quick question. That the dripper, is it a low flow, constant flow dripper?
I'm getting to that just now. Yeah, it's a 2.3 liter per hour dripper. It's 2.3 liter per hour, 0.6 meters apart.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, so just to break that down a little bit more. So what's happening here actually is that because it's a soil with a high clay content, water actually moves slowly horizontally. All right. So if you deliver the water too quickly underneath the dripper here, then you actually create a situation where that area there becomes depleted in terms of the oxygen content. So this specific design is 2.3 liters per hour and 0.6 meter spacing. So what it comes down to is that 2.3 liters per hour is too fast for that soil type. So the soil can't move the water quickly enough in a horizontal direction. And that's why that area underneath the dripper is getting too wet. And too wet conditions means anaerobic conditions. So a better design for that specific part of the block would probably have been 1.6 liter per hour. So you bring down the rate in which you apply the water, but the spacing can stay the same because you know that it's a clay soil. So you know that the soil can actually move that water horizontally far enough, but you just need to apply the water a little bit slower so that you give the soil time to actually move that water horizontally. So this photo here actually it actually represents this problem very, very nicely. So you don't want to see these pots forming. You actually want to see a wetting zone that runs completely like this from dripper to dripper. So obviously, especially if it's a variation within a block, but even if it's a whole block, there's not a lot of instances where a producer has the finances to pull out all of the drip and bring in a new system. But luckily, to a certain extent, with good irrigation scheduling, you can to a certain extent outperform a bad design. So in this specific case, the recommendation was to actually just break up the irrigation in more pulses without bringing down the volume of water that you give. So for an example, if this specific farmer has to deliver 4 millimeters of water within a specific day, then you're going to break up that 4 millimeters of water in 2 pulses. So you're sticking to your design. You know you are over applying water, or the tempo in which you are applying the water is too fine. You know that, and that is a design flaw. But you're going to stick to your design. You're just breaking it up now. So you're going to put down 2 millimeter pulses, and you're going to give 1 in the morning and 1 in the afternoon. So you're going to give that one pulse of 2 millimeters, and then you give the soil time to actually move that water horizontally. And then in the evening, you're going to give another 2 millimeters so you give that soil time to move that water. So by doing that, you are you're basically giving the soil time to move this water into that area there. And by doing that, you are ensuring that you have enough oxygen in this area here. All right, so you're still applying the same amount of water. You're still doing the 4 millimeters that you should, but you're just breaking it up in 2 pulses. And once again, I think the important thing to understand here is that when it comes down to irrigation scheduling, you're actually you're managing two things. In the foundation of irrigation scheduling is you want to give the plant the amount of water that it needs. But the more important part of irrigation scheduling is that you have to manage the oxygen content in the soil. And the only way that you can do it, especially if you have a design flaw within your system, then the only way that you can actually do it is by scheduling more effectively, bringing pulses, and obviously it's a little bit more time consuming, but that's the only way to get around it. Okay, so like I said, I don't have a NVI of the specific block, but this photo was taken at the bedded area within this block. So what I want you to see here is that you have a lot more fine root hairs, and especially in the top 10 to 20 centimeters of the soil, and that's where you really want to pick up that nutrients where you're delivering it. And the interesting thing about this soil is, once again, in terms of the soil texture itself, there isn't actually a big difference between these two. The only thing that drives this variation in the soil is actually this rock content. So you can see that this soil probably has a content of like 40% rocks, and what that does is it just creates more macropores. So even though they have the exact same texture, the rock content of this soil helps the soil to actually move that water to the side quicker, and also it moves it down quicker. And the other thing is, because you have more rocks, you have more macropores within the soils, which translates to more oxygen. So so this is a very good example where, you know, your irrigation design can actually create variation within your block, and you can spot that variation with remote sensing. Once again, I think this is quite an important thing to understand, is that we would never have seen this if we didn't go and do a physical inspection of what's going on there. A chemical inspection would never have shown this difference for us. So just relating to what I said earlier, I think sometimes we tend to place too high a value on a chemical analysis. And I'm not saying that that's not important, that is very important. But a lot of the times that chemical variation is actually driven by something else. It's actually an indirect effect of either a physical or variation within the soil itself, or maybe irrigation design flaw. All right, that's it. I don't know if you guys have any questions. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Dirk, for that very insightful presentation, and for just presenting it so professionally as well. Yeah, I'm going to open the floor now to everyone. Please, if you have any questions, now is the time. Any questions for Dirk, you can just unmute yourself and raise your hand or type a message. And yeah, the floor is open. Go ahead. Okay, I see there's one. Yes, Annalene, go ahead.
Yeah, okay. Dirk, I just wanted to ask you, so you mostly, for problem identification, you like to look at cumulative biomass production?
Annalene, yeah, I would say either if it's a problem identification, or even, you know, deciding on the spots within the block that you're going to use as part of your monitoring protocol. I think the cumulative biomass is a better one to use, because it shows differences in the block as a result of soil conditions, where sometimes, you know, you might have let's say you have an outbreak of a pest, of a certain pest, then sometimes, you know, that better area in the block can actually come down as well. And then and that can happen within a week. So so then it actually looks like the block is homogeneous, where actually it isn't. If you compare it over a longer period of time, there might be some variation there that you won't necessarily see if you use the week-to-week biomass data. But I mean, I also have to qualify that that doesn't happen quite a lot. I mean, you know, most I would say 90% of cases that weekly biomass is well represented with the cumulative biomass. They're pretty much the same in most cases, but you know, just to make sure, we rather use the cumulative biomass. You know?
Okay, yeah, no, I would have also said that, because especially in the beginning of the season, there's a lot of variation in biomass production. But once you've got full canopy, then it's kind of the same. But yeah, I want to thank you so much for this presentation. It was really insightful.
Oh, pleasure. Glad you enjoyed it. Maybe one other thing that I can mention as well is I think one thing to realize with remote sensing data is that when it started out, it was sold as a tool to make decisions in time and quickly. And I would agree that there definitely is some capability to use remote sensing data to help you with in-time decision making. But the bigger value for me lies in using the long-term data to see how you are actually moving in a specific direction. So if you have a weaker spot within a block, then you use that data to determine what's the reason for that variation. And then you use the remote sensing data over seasons to see in what way are you actually bringing up that weak area over time. So if you lose the value of remote sensing in terms of season to season rather than week to week, then I think you're losing a big part of the functionality of remote sensing data.
Thank you, Dirk. Any more questions? Everyone is just saying thank you. Thanks for all the nice words. We appreciate it. We have 3 more minutes, so if you guys can think of anything, you're more than welcome. But perhaps you need some time to ruminate, and you can always come back and just email me, and I can put you into contact with Dirk if you have any more questions for him or for FruitLook specifically as well. We're more than welcome to help you guys out. And we will be uploading this webinar onto our FruitLook YouTube page for if you want to revisit it again at a later stage as well. So yeah, if there's any more questions, please let us know. I'll give it 2 more minutes. Okay, I think everyone has asked what they wanted to ask. So then without further ado, I'll just end the webinar here. Thank you so much for everyone who joined. We really hope you found this informative, and we will be hosting more of these kinds of webinars with guest speakers like Dirk in the future. And if you can just take 2 minutes to just fill in that survey for us, we'd really appreciate your feedback as well. So thank you very much, everyone. We hope you have a fantastic day further.
Thank you. You too.
Thank you.